Take a deep breath and let your body begin to settle. Let the rhythm of your breath slow as your shoulders gently release their hold. Tonight, we'll take a quiet journey back in time to the cold, drafty, stone-walled castles of the medieval world. You've likely seen them before, in pictures, perhaps in films, towering silhouettes on distant hills, with flags fluttering and ivy creeping up old stone. But beyond the turrets and towers, the moats and drawbridges, lay a curious and often overlooked truth. Medieval castles were not nearly as glamorous or pristine as they appear in fairy tales. In fact, they could be rather messy places. Yes, messy in a most peculiar and literal way. This evening, we'll explore one such messy detail, quietly, gently, and without rush. We'll try to answer the question: why did castles have toilets that emptied onto people's heads? Our journey will meander through the daily routines of the castle's inhabitants. We'll pause at their curious architectural choices and reflect on hygiene, class, comfort, and even the overlooked realities of medieval urban planning. But don't worry. There will be no startling revelations here, only slow, careful observation. And while the question might seem odd or even unpleasant at first, I assure you, there is much to be learned in the stillness of stone walls and the quiet drip of time. Let us begin, in the most natural of places, with the daily life inside a medieval castle. Imagine yourself waking up inside the thick stone walls of a medieval castle. It's just before dawn, and the air is cool, almost cold, filtered through cracks in the wooden shutters. Your bedding is stiff, and the straw mattress underneath you rustles faintly as you move. There is no glass on the windows, just wooden slats and perhaps a bit of linen to block the breeze. The room smells faintly of smoke and something more earthy, more organic. That scent is always there. A mix of ash from the hearth, the sharp tang of rushes on the floor, and the lingering scent of the people who've lived, slept, and worked in these spaces for years. The castle is just beginning to stir. Soft footsteps echo through the corridors, perhaps a scullery maid rising early to start the fire, or a kitchen boy hurrying to fetch water from the well. The walls are thick, but the sound travels in unexpected ways. The quiet clatter of iron pots, the low mumble of a voice in prayer, the rustle of fabric as someone passes by your door. You sit up, pull your cloak tighter, and slowly begin your day. If you're a noble, you'll be attended to by servants. They'll bring a basin and ewer of lukewarm water. A thin linen cloth. Maybe even herbs, if it's a special day. But if you're a servant, or someone lower still, your morning might involve climbing narrow stairs in dim light, bucket in hand, to fetch water for someone else. Or sweeping out rushes. Or carrying night soil out through the postern gate to the edge of the outer wall. This is life in the castle. Not the grand feasts or glittering halls often depicted, but the slow repetition of tasks. The constant maintenance of space. The struggle to keep warm, to stay dry, and, perhaps more than anything else, to manage the waste of so many people living within stone walls. Because castles, while sturdy and protective, were not always pleasant. Their stone walls trapped cold and damp. Their ceilings leaked. Their fires smoked. And the presence of dozens, sometimes hundreds of people, living in close proximity, created challenges that modern eyes might not immediately see. At the heart of these challenges was the matter of hygiene. And central to that was the humble garderobe. Garderobe. A curious word. Today it might sound like a piece of fancy furniture, or perhaps a wardrobe. And in some ways, that's not far off. The word has roots in French. Garder meaning to guard, and robe meaning clothing. Originally, the garderobe was where clothes were kept, protected from lice and moths by the pungent air drifting up from a toilet chute. Yes, you heard that correctly. The smell of the toilet helped preserve clothing. Imagine yourself stepping into a small stone room built into the outer wall of the castle. A wooden bench with a hole cut into it sits above a vertical shaft. Below, many feet down, is the open air, or sometimes a pit, or even a flowing stream, if the engineers were especially clever. There's a small opening, a slit, really, allowing a thin shaft of light to enter. The stone is cold beneath your hands. The air is sharp. This is the castle's toilet. The garderobe. And this is where the day's first relief takes place. It was functional. It was efficient for its time. But it was not always safe. In some cases, especially in outer towers or castle walls that overhung the edge of a cliff or road, the waste from these toilets fell freely down into the moat or street below. And on days of strong wind or misfortune, someone passing below might receive an unpleasant surprise. But we'll return to that later. Let's linger here a little longer, in this rhythm of medieval morning. Breakfast, if it came at all, was simple. A bit of bread. Perhaps ale. Cold, thin porridge. Food was not always guaranteed, even in castles. And much of the morning was spent preparing for midday, when the main meal would be served. The kitchen was the busiest place of all. Massive hearths crackled with firewood. Blackened pots were scrubbed. Ingredients were chopped, sorted, spiced. Bread was baked in great stone ovens. Salted meat was unwrapped, soaked, and prepared. The cooks worked in rhythms of habit, muscle memory passed down through generations. And just outside the kitchen was the midden. The refuse heap. A steaming pile of discarded scraps, ash, bones, and waste. In some castles, it was located in a dedicated pit. In others, it was simply downwind. Water had to be hauled in by hand or drawn from a well. Waste had to be removed or flung. And the garderobes, though small, often forgotten outcroppings on the outer walls, were just one of many ways that castles dealt with the unceasing, daily presence of human waste. Each day, someone had to clean. Each day, someone had to sweep the rushes from the floor, scatter new herbs, scrub the wooden surfaces, refill the basins. And each day, the smells and sounds of castle life continued, layered one upon the other, like the coats of soot on the ceiling beams. In this world, comfort was not taken for granted. It was earned, in small pieces, through routine, familiarity, and the warmth of a fire shared with others. So next time you picture a grand medieval hall, remember the quiet corners, the cold stone seats, the narrow staircases leading to forgotten garderobes, and the people, just like you, who lived their days in the rhythm of stone, soot, and subtle survival. Let your mind remain soft and quiet, gently following the rhythm of time. Now that we've stepped inside the walls of a medieval castle and felt the texture of its daily routines, let's take a moment to focus more deeply, not just on what people did, but on how and why they built the world around them in a certain way. In this segment, we turn our attention toward the strange yet ingenious history of the medieval toilet, also known, as you now know, as the garderobe. And like all parts of history, even a toilet has a biography. It has a story of development, of trial and error, of adaptation. Let us begin not with the noble lords and ladies of the High Middle Ages, but much earlier. Imagine a different time, the Roman Empire. The Romans, as many may know, were remarkably advanced in their approach to sanitation. Their latrines, communal and often beautifully tiled, operated with running water beneath stone benches. Waste was flushed away through carefully engineered aqueduct systems. They even used communal sponges on sticks, a concept that seems odd today, but at the time showed a great concern for personal hygiene. But with the fall of the Roman Empire came a slow unraveling of that infrastructure. The aqueducts broke. the systems collapsed. Cities shrank. Knowledge was forgotten, or simply deemed impractical in a world that was shifting toward feudal fragmentation. By the early Middle Ages, Europe had become a quilt of rural manors, isolated villages, and rising fortresses. And with this decentralization came the need to rethink basic sanitation, but without the benefit of large-scale plumbing or municipal systems. And so, the garderobe was born. Its design was, in many ways, perfectly suited to its environment. Castles, by necessity, were elevated structures. Built for defense, they often sat atop hills, cliffs, or ridges. Walls were thick, floors stacked one above another, and space had to be used wisely. Placing a toilet within the outer wall, allowing waste to drop outside the defensive perimeter, was both logical and effective. The earliest garderobes were simple holes cut into benches of wood or stone, set above vertical shafts. Some dropped into pits below. Others extended outward, in stone projections known as murder holes or chute towers, letting gravity do the work. These outcroppings often looked like tiny balconies, sticking out precariously from the curtain wall, sometimes with a triangular or box-like appearance. Rain would occasionally help rinse the stone. But more often than not, the contents would accumulate in a trench or cesspit below, to be emptied by hand. Yes, by hand. There were people, men, often criminals or very poor, whose job it was to descend into these pits, scrape them clean, and haul the contents away. They were known, in some places, as gong farmers. The name, derived from the Old English gang, meaning to go, or, in this case, to go to the toilet. Gong farmers were paid relatively well, but their work was lonely, foul, and dangerous. They worked by torchlight. They breathed in noxious fumes. Sometimes, the pits gave way beneath them. There are, in fact, stories, quiet, tragic stories, of men drowning in cesspools. But these stories were rarely written down in full. History, after all, tends to favor the lords and the knights, not the man with the shovel. Yet their work was essential. Without them, the garderobes would overflow. Without them, disease would spread more quickly. Without them, the very function of the castle would break down in ways we seldom consider. It's easy to imagine medieval castles as places of grandeur, of feasting halls, and stained glass chapels, and brave knights polishing steel. But more often, they were places of logistics, of management, of problem-solving. The garderobe was an answer to one such problem: where does it all go? And while the idea of toilets emptying onto people's heads might seem exaggerated, or even fabricated, it's rooted in truth. Consider the construction of some castles. Walls would be built over narrow roads. Towers extended above courtyards. In moments of siege, defenders would deliberately use human waste as a weapon, pouring it down from these very chutes to repel attackers. It was known, crudely, to make scaling a wall not just dangerous, but disgusting. And in daily life, a servant walking beneath an overhanging garderobe at the wrong moment might indeed suffer an unfortunate, though unintended, surprise. Architects began to adapt. Some added stone hoods or angled chutes to deflect the waste. Others placed garderobes over isolated sections of wall or corner towers where foot traffic was minimal. But not all castles had the luxury of such thoughtful planning. And so the image remains. A world where the necessities of life, quite literally, fell down upon the heads of the unwary. Still, the garderobe was only one part of a broader system. In time, castles began to evolve. Later castles in the 13th and 14th centuries sometimes had multi-story waste chutes, collecting effluents from several floors into one vertical shaft. These shafts might terminate in a cesspit with a rudimentary cover. In certain monastic houses or especially well-planned noble residences, the garderobe might even have a flushing mechanism, using rainwater or diverted streams to carry the waste away. One such example is found at Crichton Castle in Scotland, where a remarkable system of sluices and channels was designed to direct water through the latrine shafts. It was far from modern plumbing, but it showed the growing awareness that sanitation mattered, not just for comfort, but for health. Still, most garderobes were far more basic. A seat. A hole. A drop. No privacy. No warmth. No dignity. Yet they served their purpose, quietly and without fanfare. So as we continue our journey tonight, let us keep this in mind. That even in a world of knights and banners and moats, some of the most critical innovations were found not in the armory, but in a quiet, narrow chamber, tucked into the edge of the wall, where someone, long ago, sat with their cloak gathered around their knees, and waited for the day to begin. Let your breath slow once again. As the candlelight flickers against ancient stone, we step into the quiet world of the archaeologist. Not the rushing adventurer of stories, but the careful, quiet, thoughtful observer. The one who brushes dust from brick with reverence and kneels for hours in silence to read the past, layer by humble layer. And what they find is often not what one might expect. While grand artifacts, crowns, weapons, jewelry may capture headlines, the truth is that much of what we know about medieval life comes from waste. From pits filled with broken pottery and gnawed bones. From the hardened remains of what once passed through the human body. Yes, even here, in the detritus of medieval toilets, there is history. In castles across Europe, particularly those abandoned for centuries, archaeologists have uncovered garderobes sealed in time. These small chambers, often overlooked by earlier excavators, have proven to be accidental treasure troves, not of gold or silver, but of information. Imagine crouching beside the crumbled wall of a Scottish fortress. You're brushing aside centuries of silt. And suddenly, you find it, a narrow vertical shaft in the stone, leading down to a compacted layer of blackened soil, mixed with bits of straw, fragments of leather shoes, and the shells of seeds long forgotten. This is a medieval cesspit. And within it are the silent whispers of daily life. From such places, researchers have learned what castle inhabitants ate. Seeds of plums and cherries, bones of pigs and poultry, traces of fish scales. There are remnants of textiles, wool, linen, sometimes even silk, lost or discarded during the most private of moments. There are broken combs and utensils, fragments of cloth, pins, and belt buckles. Objects that fell from pockets or sleeves during a quiet visit to the garderobe, never to be retrieved. These accidental deposits become time capsules. Because they were discarded and sealed in a place few wished to revisit, they remained untouched for centuries. And in that untouched space, truth waited. We've learned, for example, that even high-ranking nobles suffered from intestinal parasites. Microscopic studies of ancient waste, yes, even fossilized feces, called coprolites, have revealed eggs of worms, traces of undigested grain, and indicators of malnutrition or digestive distress. It reminds us, gently, that even behind the grand tapestries and heavy cloaks, bodies were fragile. That stomachs grumbled. That illness crept quietly. That no one, not even a king, could escape the rhythms of biology. Some archaeological finds are particularly surprising. At Bolton Castle in North Yorkshire, garderobes were discovered in nearly every major chamber, including the Great Hall, the Solar, and the private chambers of the Lord and Lady. These toilets extended in slender shafts through the stone, sometimes connecting to the same exit. In one curious case, a garderobe chute led directly into a passage used for servant access, a chilling echo of the question that inspired our journey. Could something truly fall on someone's head? Elsewhere, at Ravenscraig Castle in Scotland, archaeologists found a garderobe with an unusual stone drainage system, complete with a lead basin, suggesting attempts to direct waste away from key structures. And at Hedingham Castle in Essex, there's a particularly famous garderobe jutting out high above the inner courtyard. Its height and position meant that if someone had been walking below, and timing was unfortunate, they might indeed experience one of medieval life's more unpleasant surprises. But the purpose of these archaeological finds isn't to shock. Rather, it is to remind us of the full shape of life. To see medieval people not as caricatures or costume-clad actors in an old play, but as living, breathing humans. They had bad backs and bad breath. They lost buttons. They had favorite shoes. They suffered discomfort, embarrassment, and the small joys of relief on a cold morning. Even more fascinating is what these discoveries tell us about class. In castles, multiple garderobes often meant multiple levels of access and cleanliness. Lords had garderobes with more privacy. Sometimes with stone seats, even decorated niches. Servants used more exposed facilities, or shared ones. And in archaeological layers, the waste of the rich and the poor is often stratified. Different seed types. Different food remains. Even different levels of parasite infection. In places like Lübeck in Germany, where excavation of medieval latrines has been especially detailed, researchers have found shopping lists, scribbled on scraps of parchment and accidentally dropped in the loo. One reads, roughly translated: eggs, onions, vinegar. Don't forget the spice. It's the quietest kind of magic. To think that someone's shopping reminder, lost in haste or carelessness, now serves as a bridge across 7 centuries. And so, the garderobe becomes not just a place of function, but of record. As you lie back now, imagining the cool stones of a castle corridor, you might picture an archaeologist kneeling at the edge of a sunlit trench, not seeking treasure, but reading a composted manuscript of life. Each cracked plum seed, each flake of pottery, each layer of darkened loam. These are the pages of a forgotten book. One that tells us, without shame or embellishment, exactly how people lived. And what they left behind. Let your mind rest now, breathing softly with the rhythm of time. We've walked the stone corridors, peeked into narrow garderobes, and watched as archaeologists uncover the quiet evidence of centuries past. But there is something deeper still beneath the surface of daily life. Something less tangible, yet always present in the hearts and minds of medieval people, the meaning of waste. Of filth. Of cleanliness and impurity. Not just as a matter of smell or comfort, but as a reflection of morality, of spirituality, and of one's place in the order of things. To modern eyes, the medieval world may appear dirty. By our standards, it often was. Baths were rare, soap was primitive, and bodily waste was ever present. But to see this as a failure would be to misunderstand how medieval people thought. They did not divide the world in quite the same way we do. Clean and dirty, pure and impure, sacred and profane, these were not just physical states, they were spiritual conditions. Let us begin with water. While bathing was certainly practiced, particularly in Roman times and within some monastic orders, over time, water itself came to be viewed with a certain suspicion. It was associated with illness. It was believed that warm baths could open the pores and allow disease to enter the body. Better, some thought, to remain dry and protected. By the 13th century, the great public bathhouses that once thrived in cities like Paris and London had begun to decline. Some were converted into brothels. Others were shuttered altogether. Bathing became not a daily routine, but a rare event reserved for ceremonial occasions or particular acts of piety. Still, cleanliness was not neglected. Rather, it was redirected. In place of full immersion in water, medieval people relied on dry washing, wiping the body with linen cloths, applying scented herbs and powders, changing underclothes frequently, when possible. And perhaps most importantly, they focused on inner purity. In the Christian worldview that dominated much of Europe during the Middle Ages, physical filth was often seen as a metaphor, a shadow of sin, a reminder of the body's fallen state. Saints were frequently depicted as embracing filth, refusing to wash, sleeping on the earth, living among the diseased, as a sign of humility and spiritual detachment. Cleanliness was good, yes, but only if it did not become vanity. To be clean in the eyes of God was more important than to be perfumed and scrubbed before others. And this belief echoed even in the treatment of toilets. The garderobe, though functional, was tucked away, out of sight, sometimes reached by narrow passages or steep stairs. It was there, but it was not spoken of. It was necessary, but not dignified. It was a place of humility. Consider the writings of monks, those quiet chroniclers of the age. They often describe bodily needs in abstract terms. A purging of the humors, a natural evacuation. In monastic rules, the use of the latrine was governed by silence, order, and time. Certain hours were permitted. And when the community entered the necessarium, they did so in silence. No talking. No laughter. Just the soft shuffling of sandals on stone. Imagine it now. A row of stone seats, side by side. Cool light filtering through high windows. A faint breeze drifting upward through the shafts. And a line of men in simple robes, heads bowed, hands folded, enduring the most human of needs in the most structured of ways. This too was part of the medieval world. A desire to bring order to the chaos of the body. And in the secular world, much the same. Royal households employed grooms of the stool, men of rank and trust whose job was to assist the king with his toileting needs. It was not seen as demeaning, but intimate. To be so close to the sovereign in such a private act meant trust. It meant discretion. It meant one was inside the circle of power. Waste, in this context, was not embarrassing. It was simply part of life, part of rulership, part of humanity. Even art reflects this. Marginalia in medieval manuscripts, those strange, whimsical doodles along the edges, often depict animals or people relieving themselves. Sometimes monks. Sometimes devils. Sometimes entire towers of excrement. It was absurd. Comedic. And yet, part of the visual language of the time. In these images, we see a world that did not deny the body, but folded it into the great tapestry of existence. So while garderobes may have emptied onto the ground, or onto someone's head, they were not symbols of shame. They were tools. They were reminders that all people, from the lowliest servant to the grandest monarch, shared the same needs, the same biology, the same brief, awkward, necessary pauses in the rhythm of life. And when the bell tolled for Carmpline, and the castle settled into night, all would, sooner or later, make their way down the corridor, to the narrow door, to the cold stone seat, and take their place among the ancient, silent rituals of waste and renewal. Close your eyes now, and imagine a dawn without music, without comfort, and without the soft light of candles in a noble hall. Instead, hear the faint slap of leather soles on damp stone. Smell the earth-heavy air of a castle's lower passageways, and feel the weight of a wooden bucket, slightly warm from its contents, held steady by rough, calloused hands. This is the life of the castle waste-bearer, one of the countless, nameless souls whose work was never praised, never painted, and rarely recorded. Yet without them, the grand halls above would be overwhelmed. Their work was hidden, but vital. Let us follow such a servant now. His name is not remembered, but we will call him Tom, for many servants bore that name in the centuries past. Tom rises before the bell. Not in the warmth of a straw-stuffed mattress, but curled beside the kitchen hearth, wrapped in a rough woolen blanket. His back aches from yesterday's loads. His boots are still damp from the passage to the outer trench. He stands slowly, stretches beneath the weight of dawn, and begins his day. The first stop is the outer yard. There, near the stables, sits a row of buckets, some used, some clean. The used ones are heavy. Some are lids hastily shut. Some are not. Tom lifts one. Then another. Then balances a third on a makeshift yoke across his shoulders. He moves slowly. Not from laziness, but from memory. He knows every uneven stone in the corridor. He knows where the draught blows strongest. He knows when to duck beneath the low arch. And most of all, he knows the rhythm of waste. Tom's duties vary with the season. In summer, the smell is sharper. The air is thick. The pit fills more quickly, and flies gather in quiet clouds. In winter, the waste hardens. It clings to the bucket's rim. The stone steps become slick with frost. But the need is always there. Always present. Always waiting. Today, Tom's task is to clear the privy pit beneath the eastern garderobe. It's been neglected for weeks. The steward has issued no command. But Tom knows the signs, the smell seeping through the corridor wall, the slow drip where the chute used to run freely. He gathers his tools, a long-handled shovel, a rough linen cloth to tie around his face, and a flickering lantern. No one offers to help. No one offers thanks. The pit is located beyond the stables, tucked beneath the overhang of the outer wall. It is dark. Damp. Close. Tom stoops low, lifting the lid carved of old, cracked oak. Inside, a layer of composted matter rests undisturbed. Steam curls upward in the morning chill. He begins to scoop. The rhythm is steady. Scoop. Lift. Dump. Scoop. Lift. Dump. Occasionally, a sharp object, a bit of broken glass, a bone, a ring, catches his eye. He sets it aside. The ring will be returned to the steward. The glass, thrown into the ash heap. The work takes hours. By midday, Tom pauses. His muscles tremble slightly. His breath is shallow, filtered through the cloth. He takes a long sip of water from a flask, chews a piece of dried apple, and returns to work. It is a strange intimacy, this labor. Not only with waste, but with the lives that produced it. He knows who eats well. He knows who is sick. He knows whose chamber is overused, whose servant is lazy, whose steward neglects to rotate duties. In a quiet way, Tom is the castle's memory. He carries it, bucket by bucket. In the afternoon, he visits the midden, the great refuse heap. Here, bones rot beside scraps of cloth, ash, vegetable peelings, and broken tools. Tom adds the contents of the buckets. Covers them with straw. Beats back the flies. The smell clings to him, but he does not notice. It is a second skin now. A constant companion. Occasionally, a younger servant will laugh at him. Call him muckman. He does not respond. There is dignity in his silence. For he knows what the others forget. That when the garderobe overflows, they will call for him. That when illness spreads, they will seek his knowledge. That when the castle feasts and wines flow freely, he will be the one to clean the aftermath. And so, as twilight gathers, Tom rinses his tools beside the well. He does not enter the great hall. He eats a crust of bread beside the stables. He watches as the torches are lit along the parapet. He listens to the faint sound of a lute from above. And finally, beneath a tattered blanket and a sky of slow-turning stars, he lies back. The world smells of soot, and hay, and dung, and damp wool. And still, he sleeps. Because in his own quiet way, Tom has kept the castle alive. Let your breath slow now. Let your shoulders fall just a little heavier. And picture yourself no longer inside a fortress of stone, but walking the uneven cobbled paths of a medieval town, just as the morning mist begins to lift. Perhaps it is the 14th century. The sky is low with a pale haze. The rooftops are thatched, crooked, and slumped together like huddled villagers. Smoke drifts from chimneys, curling into the cool dawn air. And below the rooftops and their yawning windows, something else moves through the town. Something older than the buildings. Older than the carts or the baker's door. It is waste, and it flows in rhythm with life itself. In these towns, there are no sewers as we know them. No underground pipes, no manholes, no sanitation departments. Instead, there are gutters, shallow, open channels that run down the center or along the sides of the street. And into these gutters, everything is thrown. Chamber pot contents. Kitchen scraps. Fish bones. Soapy grey water from laundry. Blood from the butcher's stall. Even rotting offal from tanneries. It all merges. It all flows. And the townspeople, in their daily rhythm, hardly flinch at the sight. Let's follow one, shall we? Her name is Elda, a widow who sells turnips and leeks in the market square. She rises before the bells, pulls on her woolen shawl, and takes her chamber pot to the window. She does not descend the stairs. She does not whisper an apology. She simply leans out the shutter, calls garderobes. A warning cry from the old French gardes l'eau, meaning watch out for the water, and empties the pot into the street below. The sound is familiar. The splash is ignored. A dog trots by, unbothered. Children leap across puddles on their way to the bakehouse. Merchants pull carts through narrow lanes already slick with waste. Women carry baskets above their heads, their skirts held high, careful not to let the hems dip too low into the murky runoff. The smell is omnipresent. It rises from the gutters. It lingers on doorsteps. It nestles into cloth and settles beneath fingernails. But to those who live here, it is simply the scent of life. Tanners, dyers, fishmongers, each trade has its own contribution to the city's aroma. And yet, there is a strange order to it all. In some towns, a town scavenger, also known as a raker, is hired to clear the worst of the filth. He passes through each street with a cart and a shovel, scooping muck, loading buckets, and carting it outside the walls to be dumped or used on fields. In certain cities, curfews were introduced. No dumping was allowed after dark. Heavy fines were placed upon those who flung filth from upper windows without warning. But enforcement was inconsistent. Laws were passed, repealed, ignored, and rewritten. In London, a law in 1307 stated that butchers could not throw blood and offal into the Thames. By 1310, they were doing it again. In 1345, Paris banned the disposal of human waste in public fountains. Yet, mothers still bathed their babies in buckets beside those very fountains the next morning. It was a dance. A balance. a messy equilibrium between need and decay. Let us pause now beside one such gutter, shall we? Picture the water, sluggish, dark, dotted with feathers, straw, bits of cabbage leaf, a dead rat perhaps. It moves in fits and starts, nudged by footfall, wheel, and rain. And still, it is not entirely without use. Some towns built their streets with a slight central dip, so rainwater could wash the waste away. Others developed sluices, simple wooden gates to direct flow. In wet seasons, the streets would be cleaner. In dry months, the stench would settle like a blanket. But amid all this filth, life thrived. Vendors sold pies from carts beside open gutters. Lovers met in alleyways faint with urine and rosewater perfume. Children splashed and giggled as they skipped across planks set over wet patches. Cats hunted rats. Dogs scavenged bones. Pigs rooted in the refuse. And no one thought it strange. Because strange is what you do not know. To them, this was simply home. The wealthy had some reprieve. They might live on higher streets, where water flowed faster, or pay boys to clear the path before them. They might carry posies to their noses or burn sweet herbs in brass censers. But even the finest lords and ladies would sometimes step in something best left unnamed. There was no true escape. Not really. Even monasteries, with their stone cloisters and orderly routines, had their own gutters and latrines. Even royal courts, with all their perfumes and pomp, had chamber pots emptied by servants into the same public drains as everyone else. All were equal, in the end, before the muck. Let us now step outside the city walls. There, beyond the reach of tax collectors and alehouses, is the midden field, a wide, open stretch where carts unload their filth. It steams in the cold morning. It teems with life, worms, beetles, birds, and the occasional scavenger looking for rags or coins or usable scraps. And yet, in time, this waste will become fertilizer. Mixed with straw and ash, it will be spread across fields. Turned by hand. Baked by sun. And there, in that dirt, peas will grow. And wheat. And beans. To be brought back into the city once more. A cycle. Endless. Eternal. Waste to food. Food to waste. And all the while, the people walk above it. Living. Laughing. Sleeping. Loving. Not despite the filth, but within it. Take a deep breath now. Let your mind picture again the solid silhouette of a medieval castle, standing against the grey horizon like a memory carved in rock. But instead of focusing on the towers and battlements, let your attention glide softly downward to a small, often overlooked detail. A boxy projection. A tiny turret. A barely visible alcove jutting out from a high wall. And within it, a hole. A stone seat. A silent mystery of castle life. You are looking at a garderobe. The castle toilet. Not just one, but perhaps dozens hidden throughout the thick, ancient walls. Let us step inside one. The stone is cold beneath your feet. The air smells of time, of damp mortar and a faint, earthy musk. The chamber is narrow, sometimes no larger than a wardrobe. There may be a small slit for light, or none at all. You sit on a flat, smooth slab with a round opening at the center. Beneath the hole, a dark shaft plummets downward. Sometimes it opens straight into the moat. Sometimes into a pit, or even the open air. And it is in this silence that you realize this was no crude accident. The garderobe was a feat of practical engineering. But it did not begin this way. In the early days of castles, waste was a secondary concern. Early Norman Motte and Bailey castles relied on simple privy pits, holes in the ground, lined with wood or stone, dug outside the main keep. Servants and soldiers used communal pits. Lords and ladies might have pots emptied by hand. But over time, as castles grew more permanent, more stone than timber, the garderobe became a necessary innovation. By the 12th century, architects began building them into the very structure. Some garderobes were tucked into thick outer walls, their chutes angling downward through the masonry, concealed behind stone facades. Others were constructed in turret-like projections, called garderobe towers, which stuck out from the main structure, allowing gravity to carry waste far away from the walls. This design was not only more sanitary, but also more secure. A well-placed garderobe chute could prevent enemies from tunneling beneath the castle. After all, who would dig through that? In castles such as Dover or Chepstow, one can still find garderobes spaced regularly throughout the keep, some simple and small, others spacious enough for 2 or 3 seats. Indeed, multi-seat garderobes were not uncommon in larger castles. Imagine now a chamber with 3 or 4 stone seats, each carved neatly in a row like pews in a chapel. No partitions. No privacy. Just cool stone and candlelight. And here, side by side, the noble family might relieve themselves together. Brothers beside sisters. Lords beside cousins. Perhaps even talking softly while the wind whispered through the walls. For us, it might seem strange. But privacy, as we know it, was a different idea then. Modesty took a back seat to function. And within the stonework of some castles, one finds a level of planning that borders on brilliance. In Chateau Gallard, the fortress built by Richard the Lionheart, garderobes were carefully positioned to drain into sloped chutes that carried waste away from the castle cliffs. At Harlech, garderobes were placed in vertical rows, one above the other, with finely carved shafts allowing waste to flow through multiple levels. Even in windswept Edinburgh, the famous castle perched on a volcanic rock, garderobes were drilled through dense basalt, forming tight chutes that exited along sheer cliff faces. And yet, despite all this planning, life could still be unpleasant. During sieges, when water was scarce and exits dangerous, garderobes became risky places. Smells built up. Rats took refuge. And in some cases, attackers tried to climb up the chutes to infiltrate the castle, only to find themselves trapped in filth and stone. To counter this, certain castles designed their garderobe shafts with hidden traps. Narrow bends, iron grates, or even wooden blocks that could be dropped into place. Now, let us pause again. Step outside the garderobe and walk softly down a hall lit by torches. The walls curve. The stone hums. And there, on your left, is the gong farmer, a man whose job was to clean out the waste pits beneath the garderobes. He works at night. He smells of lime and damp leather. He carries a long-handled rake and a lantern. His job is dangerous and thankless. The fumes alone can knock a man unconscious. The ladders are slippery. And one wrong step means plunging into filth. And yet, he is paid well. Respected, even feared. For without him, the castle's sanitation collapses. In the great hall, nobles feast on roasted boar and spiced pears. In the chapel, monks chant and kneel in prayer. But beneath their feet, the gong farmer clears the waste. Every pipe. Every chute. Every stinking cesspit. Now let us move higher. To the castle's top floors. Where the lord's private chamber has its own luxurious garderobe, perhaps with a wooden seat, a small window, and even shelves built into the wall. And on those shelves? Strips of cloth, soft moss, a handful of lavender sprigs. Medieval toilet paper, if you will. Cleanliness was a matter of degree. Some castles kept buckets of sand or ash to absorb smell. Others used vinegar to rinse the seat. And in wealthier homes, the stone was rubbed smooth, cool to the touch, almost comforting. To stand in such a chamber, centuries later, is to feel something almost sacred. The stillness, the humility, the quiet ingenuity of human waste, handled with care. From the vaulted ceilings to the smooth seat beneath your thighs, everything was planned. Not glamorous, not glorious, but necessary. And in that necessity, you find the strange heart of medieval life. A life not above filth, but surrounded by it. Managing it. Living with it. Even building beauty and power atop it. The wind shifts. The mist clears. And now we find ourselves under a different sky. No longer grey and rain-soaked, but warm, golden, filled with the scent of spices and the murmur of fountains. This is Al-Andalus, Moorish Spain. A world where learning, hygiene, and architecture thrived in harmony with one another. While the stone castles of northern Europe struggled with cesspits and garderobes, the palaces and fortresses of Islamic Spain embraced a more elegant approach to sanitation. Let's step softly into the Alhambra in Granada. A marvel of the 13th and 14th centuries. Walls of carved plaster, ceilings like starlight frozen in time, and beneath it all, hidden channels, a sophisticated water system, and yes, toilets. In Islamic castles and homes, lavatories were built with care and intent. Rather than cutting holes into outer walls, many palaces had internal plumbing of a sort. Stone or ceramic pipes that funneled water from nearby aqueducts, cisterns, or rooftop tanks to flush waste away. Waste was not seen as something to be ignored or feared. It was understood, managed, and integrated into urban infrastructure. In cities like Córdoba and Toledo, water and sewer systems were advanced enough to allow for public baths, private latrines, and even laws governing cleanliness. In many Islamic fortresses, toilets were placed adjacent to baths and washrooms, recognizing that cleanliness was not only physical, it was spiritual. Wudu, the ritual washing before prayer, demanded a supply of clean water and a place for proper hygiene. So waste systems were built within the broader architecture of cleanliness. Even travelers remarked on the contrast. When Christian knights entered Andalusian cities during the Reconquista, they were amazed by the abundance of fountains, bathhouses, and lavatories that did not stink. A stark difference from the sludge pits of northern keeps. But now we move farther east. Let us float over deserts and mountains. To the palaces of the Ottoman Empire and beyond, where the knowledge of Roman aqueducts and Persian gardens merged into something refined and enduring. In cities like Istanbul, large-scale waste management was already well established. Ottoman engineers used lead piping, drainage channels, and stone-lined latrines that flushed with gravity and water pressure. In elite homes, a toilet was a small tiled room, connected to a drainage shaft leading to a cesspit or a flowing water channel. These weren't castle garderobes perched dangerously on outer walls. They were integrated chambers, often attached to bathing suites or tucked behind private gardens. And they were almost always accompanied by water for washing, rinsing, and cleansing. Even in the bustling streets of cities like Damascus or Baghdad, communal latrines and bathhouses were commonplace. So while a European noble might relieve himself above a stinking pit that emptied into the moat, an Ottoman vizier might sit in a private tiled chamber, rinse with warm water, and dry himself with soft cloth. But let's not stop here. Let us drift farther still, to Asia, where innovations in waste systems had reached a fascinating complexity long before castles dotted Europe. In medieval Japan, castles like Himeji or Matsumoto often included latrines connected to composting systems. Yes, composting. Waste from toilets was collected not to be dumped, but to be reused. This practice, called night soil farming, was widespread in many parts of East Asia. Human waste was carefully gathered, stored, and sold to farmers for use as fertilizer. This wasn't a crude or shameful job, it was regulated. Merchants purchased the rights to collect night soil from particular districts. Buckets were used instead of open chutes, and in many towns, night soil collectors made daily rounds. Like milkmen in reverse. The system was so integrated that in some places, toilet contracts were negotiated between homeowners and collectors. It was a form of circular sanitation. Nothing wasted. Everything reused. Japanese castles, unlike their European counterparts, were built with a close relationship to the surrounding economy. Toilets were not merely functional, but part of a larger cycle of sustainability. And in China, the story was similar. As far back as the Tang and Song dynasties, urban planning included waste channels, latrine laws, and filtration systems in rivers and canals. Chinese imperial palaces had ornate toilet chambers, sometimes built with marble seats and hand-washing basins. In some texts, we even find mention of scented papers, herbal rinses, and lavender oils used in elite bathrooms. A different world, indeed. And yet, even here, there were echoes of familiar problems. Blockages. Overflows. Disgust. Sanitation, no matter how advanced, always required maintenance, care, and, above all, respect. In the Mongol Empire, which stretched across continents, temporary camps had simple pit toilets, but commanders enforced strict rules about waste disposal, cleanliness, and water safety. And in India, particularly under the Delhi Sultanate, early step wells and drainage systems were used to manage not just water, but the waste carried by it. Some fortress cities, like Jodhpur, even had toilet towers designed with chutes that led to carefully constructed stone tanks. In all of these cultures, across Islamic, East Asian, and South Asian civilizations, we see a recurring theme. Waste was not ignored. It was studied, engineered, and woven into daily life. Perhaps it wasn't romantic. Perhaps no poet sang of saws or toilet chutes. But behind every great palace, every throne, and every noble title, there was a system of water, of waste, of humble necessity. Let's pause again now. Return gently to your resting place. Feel the quiet of the ancient world, the soft weight of centuries. The castles may change. The languages. The stones. The seasons. But the human body remains. And across time and empire, humans always had to find a way to answer nature's call with dignity. It is a quiet night in the 13th century. A castle sleeps beneath a veil of fog. Guards lean on their spears. Fires crackle low. All is still, except beneath the floorboards. Through the narrow shaft of a garderobe, where nobles once relieved themselves into the darkness below, something begins to stir. A rope creaks. A boot touches stone. A soldier is climbing up through the latrine shaft, emerging silently into the very heart of the fortress. It might sound absurd, but in the high-stakes game of medieval siege warfare, toilets were weak points. Exploitable. Dangerous. And sometimes, fatal. European castle entry by excrement, the garderobe as a secret door. Castle architects often focused their defensive efforts on gates, drawbridges, and arrow slits. But many overlooked the lowly toilet. The garderobe, after all, was just a small wooden seat with a hole above a vertical chute, often hanging outside the castle wall, or leading to a cesspit below. To the enemy, however, this was an open shaft, a potential tunnel into the stronghold. And in more than one recorded case, attackers used the toilet shaft as an entrance. In 1338, during the siege of Château Galad in France, soldiers are believed to have infiltrated the castle by climbing up a latrine chute, emerging near the kitchens, where guards were inattentive. It was disgusting. It was dangerous. But it worked. These passages, sometimes no more than 18 inches wide, became unexpected vulnerabilities. Cesspits, when dry or shallow, could be crossed. Ropes lowered. Footsteps muffled. And suddenly, the fortress that seemed impenetrable was breached from below. Toilets became liabilities. And castle builders began to reinforce garderobes, sometimes placing iron grates beneath the seat or adding sharp-angled chutes to make climbing difficult. Others simply raised their cesspits, so there was no accessible shaft from outside. A siege commander needed to think like sewage. Where could a rat squeeze through? Where did the stink lead? That's where the soft spot might lie. But the danger of toilets wasn't limited to sieges. Sometimes, the deadliest plots came from within. Detective ## poisons, plots, and the privy chamber. A lord sits down to relieve himself. The chamber is quiet. His guard is gone. He pulls the door shut and rests in what should be solitude. But in the narrow space beneath him, poison waits. Some medieval assassins understood that a toilet was one of the few moments of vulnerability for a high-ranking noble. Unarmed. Alone. Distracted. A favorite method? Poisoning the seat, the walls, or even the air. In castles with dry cesspits, toxic powders or herbal poisons could be planted beneath the seat to emit dangerous fumes over time. In one particularly eerie legend from medieval Poland, a duke was found dead in his privy chamber after inhaling fumes released by burning herbs that had been laced with arsenic. Fact or fable? It's hard to say. But it reflects a deeper truth. The toilet was not only a physical weak point, it was a moment of psychological vulnerability. Some rulers, like King Edward I of England, had guarded privy chambers, with bodyguards posted outside during their use. Others used portable commodes rather than fixed garderobes to avoid predictability. One curious case involves the German Prince Bishop Albert of Riga, who is said to have died after falling through a rotten toilet floor, whether by sabotage or neglect remains unknown. In every dark corner of history, there is a tale of someone who fell victim to their own excremental architecture. Explosion symbol weaponized waste. When moats and cesspits became biological weapons. The smell of a medieval moat was rarely clean. Often, toilets emptied directly into them, creating a stew of rotting food, sewage, animal waste, and refuse. But sometimes, these foul waters became weapons themselves. During the siege of a castle or walled city, defenders would contaminate nearby rivers or wells used by attackers, often with human or animal waste, hoping to trigger disease. In the 1340s, as the Black Death swept through Europe, waste became even more sinister. There are accounts, some exaggerated, some likely real, of armies catapulting diseased corpses, excrement-filled barrels, or even dead animals over castle walls to spread illness and fear. Waste, in this context, became biological warfare. In Bohemian sieges, defenders were known to dump boiling sewage from the tops of towers onto attackers scaling ladders. It wasn't just about burning flesh, it was about infection. A wound soaked in excrement was likely to fester. Infection, in an age without antibiotics, was often a slow and terrifying death. This created a cruel calculus in siege warfare. Could you not only starve your enemies, but sicken them with the very filth you flushed away? Even castles themselves were sometimes designed with overhanging garderobes that could be used to drop waste on intruders directly below the wall, accidentally or intentionally. And for desperate defenders, any liquid was better than none, even if that liquid had already been passed once before. Nauseated face shame, mockery, and the toilet as a symbol of humiliation. Beyond death, toilets were also used for political and social humiliation. In medieval England, French nobles captured in battle were sometimes locked in garderobe towers, left to suffer not just in isolation, but in stench. A form of psychological punishment. In Flanders, one feuding noble had a painting made of his rival sitting on a toilet and displayed it publicly as an act of mockery. In later centuries, this became a common satirical motif, leaders depicted on chamber pots, relieving themselves, as a way of diminishing their dignity. Because the toilet, though necessary, was a reminder of human frailty. And in the brutal world of politics and war, humiliation was as powerful a weapon as a sword. So now we've seen the toilet not just as a tool of survival, but as a tactic, a threat, a trapdoor to downfall. From the creeping soldier climbing through filth, to the poisoned noble on his cedarwood seat, to the boiling sewer poured upon a siege tower. The toilet was never just a hole in the wall. It was a battlefield, a secret passage, a hidden danger. But for now, let's ease back from these darker places. Let the shadows fall away. Let the siege camps quiet. Let the stench clear. You're safe again, in your quiet chamber, wrapped in blankets and history. The danger has passed. For the next segment, we'll explore how castles eventually evolved their sanitation toward privacy, plumbing, and porcelain. It's the late Middle Ages now, perhaps the 15th century. Europe has endured centuries of war, famine, plague, and crude sanitation. But something is shifting. The cities are growing. Towns are becoming denser. And with that density comes a problem: where does the waste go? The old methods, tossing chamber pot contents into the street, letting garderobes drip into cesspits, are no longer sustainable. The smell is unbearable. The disease is spreading. And people, commoners and nobles alike, begin to demand something better. Let's follow the quiet revolution that transformed how people thought about human waste. The urban cesspit crisis. As medieval cities expanded, houses were packed closer together. Narrow alleys, timber structures, and poor ventilation made sanitation a nightmare. And most homes still used chamber pots, small bowls or basins, emptied, ideally, into a designated pit, though often just dumped out the window. In many cities like London, Paris, or Florence, these waste disposal methods created public health disasters. By the 14th and 15th centuries, urban areas were overflowing, literally, with filth. The cesspits dug beside homes would fill quickly, often within weeks. Some people paid rakers or gong farmers to empty them, but these workers were expensive, few, and reviled. Most people didn't bother. And so waste began to seep into the ground, infect wells, and spread into the basements of neighboring houses. The stink was unrelenting. One London chronicle from 1326 describes how the air hung heavy with rot from overflowing pits on every block. The people began to revolt, not just against each other, but against the very structure of their cities. The need for better waste management became impossible to ignore. And so, cities began to regulate toilets. Some required cesspits to be sealed and covered. Others banned the throwing of chamber pot contents into streets, punishable by public whipping. The seeds of modern sanitation were being planted, not by inventors, but by desperation. But change, as always, came unevenly. Let's return to the castles for a moment, where the elite still sought elegance amid excrement. European castle: the rise of sophisticated garderobe systems. By the late medieval period, castle architects began rethinking their garderobes. The earliest garderobes were simple: a seat, a hole, a chute. But by the 15th century, the more elaborate castles introduced stacked garderobes, multi-level systems that served several floors of a keep, often with a sloping drain to direct the flow into a cesspit or stream. In some cases, they even had stone basins with channels that allowed rainwater to flush the waste downward, a primitive form of gravity-assisted flushing. A few castles had garderobe towers built outward from the main walls, allowing waste to fall straight into rivers or moats. Both as a convenience and, unfortunately, a method of environmental dumping. In castles like Bodiam Castle in England or Château de Pierrefonds in France, garderobes were connected to underground stone drains, which were cleaned periodically. These systems were not luxurious by modern standards, but they represented intentional design, planning, and an attempt to separate humans from their waste. Privacy, too, was beginning to matter. Some garderobes had doors, locking latches, and ventilation holes. The seats might be covered with wooden lids to reduce odor. Some were even carpeted around the base, not for cleanliness, but for warmth. It wasn't quite a bathroom yet. But it was no longer just a hole in the wind. Shower the privy evolves, from public shame to personal space. For most of medieval Europe, using the toilet had never been a private act. It was something done in communal spaces, or hurriedly in alleys, or on a castle seat with a servant standing by. But slowly, ideas began to shift. Monasteries and universities, places that valued order and cleanliness, began constructing latrine blocks with multiple seats in rows, often over a flowing stream. These were still communal, but more systematic. The 12th century Rievaulx Abbey in England had a long row of stone seats with running water below, an early sanitation marvel. Monks were expected to use them in silence, and the areas were cleaned by designated brothers. In towns, wealthier homes began building indoor privies, essentially enclosed closets with a seat, often located off the kitchen or near a bedroom. By the 1500s, these rooms were sometimes decorated with tiles, tapestries, or even religious symbols, a strange blend of sacred and profane. Why decorate a toilet? Because it was becoming a room, a space of its own. Still smelly. Still rudimentary. But no longer invisible. The age of the toilet as an architectural feature had begun. And not just in castles or monasteries. Even merchant homes were catching up. But for a truly revolutionary moment, we must look east. To a city where cleanliness had long been a civic virtue. Globe with Asia, Australia, the Eastern influence, Japanese and Islamic sanitation systems. While Europe struggled through centuries of cesspits and chamber pots, other parts of the world were far ahead. In Japan, by the Heian period, 8th to 12th century, noble homes often had flush toilets connected to water streams or canals. In Islamic cities, such as Cordoba, Baghdad, or Cairo, houses had indoor toilets connected to underground sewer systems, with running water, tile work, and even ventilation chimneys. Public bathhouses included lavatories, which were cleaned regularly and designed with privacy in mind. Islamic law emphasized cleanliness as a religious duty, and that principle extended to waste management. In some cities, public latrines had attendants, cleaning routines, and even incense burners to reduce odor. Europe was behind. But as contact increased through trade, war, and exploration, European architects began to learn from these designs. By the Renaissance, travelers returning from the East brought stories of cities where the streets were clean, the toilets private, and the air unpolluted by waste. It inspired envy and, eventually, innovation. So we leave behind the darkest chapters, the siege tunnels, the poisons, the cesspits. We are now standing on the threshold of modern sanitation. A world where people no longer accepted filth as fate. Where the toilet was no longer a hole, but a mechanism. A system. A statement of dignity. Next, in segment 11, we'll step fully into the early modern period and witness the invention of the flushing toilet, the porcelain throne, and the emergence of the modern bathroom. We now find ourselves at the twilight of the medieval world. Cities are larger. Castles are quieter. And the medieval mindset, rooted in superstition, filth, and fatalism, is slowly giving way to a world of inquiry, science, and curiosity. The Renaissance is unfolding, and with it comes a rebirth of many things, including how people deal with their bodily waste. Let's begin with a man you may not have heard of, but whose invention would one day become as common as the door handle. A man who dared to dream of a better toilet. Toilet Sir John Harington, the Elizabethan flush. The year is 1596. Queen Elizabeth I sits upon the throne of England. And her godson, a clever and mischievous courtier named Sir John Harington, is tinkering with a strange new device in his home. He calls it the Ajax. What is it? Essentially, it is a flushing toilet. A raised seat above a bowl, with a cistern of water above it. When a handle is pulled, water flows down to flush the contents away. It is a marvel. A clean, effective, and revolutionary idea. Harington even writes a tongue-in-cheek book about it. Filled with satire and elaborate metaphor, as if discussing a literary topic rather than something as humble as a toilet. He installs one in his own home. And, more daringly, in Richmond Palace, for the Queen herself. Queen Elizabeth is said to have used it once, and then politely ignored it. Why? Because England, and indeed Europe, wasn't ready for such a leap. Water pressure was poor. Plumbing was inconsistent. And the cultural mindset still hadn't caught up. People were used to chamber pots and garderobes. The idea of water rushing through pipes to flush away excrement felt unnatural, even risky. And so Harington's invention vanished into obscurity. But the seed was planted. The idea of a clean, water-based toilet had been born. It would take centuries to fully bloom. But let's not rush ahead. There's still much to explore in this slow evolution. Soap, water, and sanitation, the growing importance of cleanliness. By the 17th century, personal hygiene was becoming more fashionable among Europe's elite. Perfumed water, scented handkerchiefs, and bathing, though still infrequent, began to signal refinement and status. And as the concept of cleanliness grew, so too did the desire for cleaner spaces, including toilet spaces. The chamber pot, once a casual object placed under beds or behind curtains, was now being stored in purpose-built cabinets known as commodes. These elegant wooden boxes disguised the pot, reduced odors, and allowed for more discreet use. Some commodes were ornate, carved from mahogany, inlaid with ivory, even upholstered with velvet. You might mistake one for a piece of living room furniture until you opened the lid. In some homes, servants would quietly collect the pot, empty it, and return it, all without a word. It was still a primitive system. But the emotional distance from one's own waste was growing. Privacy was becoming precious. Discretion was becoming dignified. Even the king's chamber pot, once emptied proudly by nobles, was now hidden behind screens or cabinets. The throne was beginning to look like a throne. Droplet early plumbing experiments, the pipe dreams of the Enlightenment. As cities expanded, so too did the need for real plumbing systems. In France, Louis XIV's palace at Versailles had over 1,000 rooms, but no centralized toilets. Chamber pots were used freely, and courtiers relieved themselves in hallways and stairwells. The stench became so unbearable that perfumed fountains were placed in corridors to mask the odors. But by the 18th century, inventors across Europe were experimenting with underground piping, closed-source systems, and gravity-fed waste disposal. One early success was Alexander Cumming, a Scottish watchmaker who, in 1775, patented the first flush toilet to include an S-shaped trap. This S-trap created a water seal that blocked so gases from rising back into the toilet. A crucial innovation that made indoor toilets far more hygienic. Just a few decades later, in the 19th century, Thomas Crapper, a plumber and businessman, would popularize sanitary flush toilets with pull chains, porcelain bowls, and reliable drainage systems. And no, he didn't invent the toilet. But he marketed it brilliantly. His name became synonymous with bathroom use, not because of the invention, but because of his success in normalizing the idea of having a toilet in your home. But we're not quite there yet. Let's pause and examine the quiet transition from the shared, exposed, cold stone garderobe to the cozy, private, indoor bathroom. The toilet room emerges, ventilation, privacy, and respectability. In medieval castles, toilets were placed along the outer walls, usually in towers, isolated, cold, and vulnerable. But by the 17th and 18th centuries, some manor houses and aristocratic residences began incorporating indoor privies into their floor plans. These were enclosed rooms, often called necessaries or water closets. They featured wooden seats, decorated panels, and sometimes a small window for ventilation. Servants would still have to empty the waste manually, but the experience was more private and less drafty. The idea of going to the toilet without being exposed to the wind, rain, or eavesdropping neighbors was revolutionary. By the 18th century, upper-class homes began adding dedicated water closet rooms, sometimes even with lockable doors. The chamber pot didn't disappear overnight. But the idea that toilets could be private, clean, and even elegant was spreading fast. The castle garderobe had officially been retired. The era of ceramic bowls, flash handles, and white porcelain dignity was dawning. We are now on the cusp of modernity. From pits in towers to perfumed cabinets, from siege weapons to polished porcelain. Toilets had finally become something worth hiding, designing, and eventually celebrating. In the final segment, we'll look at the psychological transformation of the toilet, from shame to status symbol, and how the evolution of toilets reflected our own evolution as humans, from survival to society to self-respect. Imagine the quiet hum of activity in the lower levels of a medieval castle, below the great halls and noble chambers, beneath the flickering torchlight of winding corridors, past the workshops and larders, and further still. There, down in the dim recesses of the stone foundations, where the walls sweated with damp and the air was thick with the mingled scents of earth, mildew, and humanity, lived the beating heart of the castle, its servants. For those tasked with the daily operation of the castle's intricate systems, cleaning, cooking, hauling water, preparing beds, maintaining fires, life was not lived in the finery of feasts or the privilege of courts, but rather in the perpetual rhythm of labor. And for many, their workspace or even sleeping quarters might lie just beneath the latrines. Yes, directly beneath. You see, the architecture of many medieval castles was not a matter of comfort, it was one of hierarchy and function. Privies, or garderobes, were often situated in vertical stacks or built along external walls. These emptied through vertical shafts or chutes that carried the waste down into cesspits, moats, or open ground below. In the more elaborate castles, these chutes might lead to waste channels, rudimentary drainage systems, or ditches. But in less sophisticated or simply more crowded structures, the area beneath the toilets could sometimes be a place of human activity, kitchens, storerooms, or even servant dormitories. It was not ideal, but it was practical. For many castle servants, especially lower-ranked staff such as kitchen boys, scullions, or cleaners, choices were few. One might sleep in a corner of the kitchen, near the hearth for warmth. One might bed down in a hallway alcove or even a space near the walls. And some, whether out of necessity or poor planning, might find themselves beneath the latrine chutes, spaces that, while undesirable, were sheltered, dry, and marginally warmer during winter due to the presence of enclosed stone. Of course, measures were taken to limit exposure. Stone deflectors or catchment sometimes redirected waste flow. A gutter, a wooden barrier, even a simple linen sheet might be hung to catch the drips. But accidents happened. The sounds above, grinding doors of privies opening, soft groans of seated nobles, the sudden splash, became a part of the background for some servants, as natural as the wind in the chimneys. And the smell? It lingered. Many described a kind of olfactory numbness. After weeks or months below the chutes, the stench dulled into the fabric of their clothing, the walls of the chambers, even the pores of their skin. Perfumed herbs were a luxury, though some castle kitchens hung dried lavender or rosemary from the rafters, not just for cooking, but for masking the odor. Ashes from the hearth were sometimes scattered beneath the chutes to reduce smell and aid decomposition. Lime, when available, was the gold standard for neutralizing the worst of it. But lime was costly and used sparingly. Yet despite all this, the servants endured. They found rhythm in the repetition, in the clang of pots, the crackle of firewood, the scurry of rats in the walls. Friendships blossomed in those low-lit chambers. Songs were whispered during evening tasks. A girl might confide her secrets while peeling root vegetables. A boy might boast of how quickly he could clear a chamber pot. There was even humor, crude and gallows-like. A shared joke about the lord's eating habits predicting the danger of passing beneath his privy. Tales of revenge where servants might time a bucket toss to coincide with someone else's unfortunate journey. Some castles had tales of the cursed bucket, an unlucky spot where everything that could fall would. Servants invented superstitions to explain the worst-located chutes, as if the structure had been built not by men, but by mischievous spirits with a taste for humiliation. They'd knock on beams or carry charms, hoping to avoid a literal disaster from above. The social contrast could not have been more stark. Just meters above, nobles dined on roasted meats, laid on feather beds, and used latrines built into warm towers. Below, the servants who ensured the smooth function of those luxuries lived with the consequence of their waste, sometimes literally falling into their world. Yet this system, as odd and uncomfortable as it might seem to us today, was a testament to medieval ingenuity and necessity. Castles were not designed for sanitation. They were built for defense, dominance, and the assertion of control. The internal infrastructure, such as it was, emerged as a series of compromises, between comfort and practicality, between prestige and plumbing. And the servants bore the brunt of those compromises. Still, in the darkest corners of those drafty corridors, life went on. Meals were cooked. Beds were turned. Floors were scrubbed. And while the occasional splash from above may have been a rude reminder of their station, for many servants, life beneath the chute was simply life. Not cursed. Not extraordinary. Just one more part of the rhythm of their days. Just another note in a long, quiet song of castle existence. Imagine the quiet hum of activity in the lower levels of a medieval castle, below the great halls and noble chambers, beneath the flickering torchlight of winding corridors, past the workshops and larders, and further still. There, down in the dim recesses of the stone foundations, where the walls sweated with damp and the air was thick with the mingled scents of earth, mildew, and humanity, lived the beating heart of the castle, its servants. For those tasked with the daily operation of the castle's intricate systems, cleaning, cooking, hauling water, preparing beds, maintaining fires, life was not lived in the finery of feasts or the privilege of courts, but rather in the perpetual rhythm of labor. And for many, their workspace or even sleeping quarters might lie just beneath the latrines. Yes, directly beneath. You see, the architecture of many medieval castles was not a matter of comfort, it was one of hierarchy and function. Privies, or garderobes, were often situated in vertical stacks or built along external walls. These emptied through vertical shafts or chutes that carried the waste down into cesspits, moats, or open ground below. In the more elaborate castles, these chutes might lead to waste channels, rudimentary drainage systems, or ditches. But in less sophisticated or simply more crowded structures, the area beneath the toilets could sometimes be a place of human activity, kitchens, storerooms, or even servant dormitories. It was not ideal. But it was practical. For many castle servants, especially lower-ranked staff such as kitchen boys, scullions, or cleaners, choices were few. One might sleep in a corner of the kitchen, near the hearth for warmth. One might bed down in a hallway alcove or even a space near the walls. And some, whether out of necessity or poor planning, might find themselves beneath the latrine chutes. Spaces that, while undesirable, were sheltered, dry, and marginally warmer during winter due to the presence of enclosed stone. Of course, measures were taken to limit exposure. Stone deflectors or catchment sometimes redirected waste flow. A gutter, a wooden barrier, even a simple linen sheet might be hung to catch the drips. But accidents happened. The sounds above, grinding doors of privies opening, soft groans of seated nobles, the sudden splash, became a part of the background for some servants, as natural as the wind in the chimneys. And the smell? It lingered. Many described a kind of olfactory numbness. After weeks or months below the chutes, the stench dulled into the fabric of their clothing, the walls of the chambers, even the pores of their skin. Perfumed herbs were a luxury, though some castle kitchens hung dried lavender or rosemary from the rafters, not just for cooking, but for masking the odor. Ashes from the hearth were sometimes scattered beneath the chutes to reduce smell and aid decomposition. Lime, when available, was the gold standard for neutralizing the worst of it. But lime was costly and used sparingly. Yet despite all this, the servants endured. They found rhythm in the repetition, in the clang of pots, the crackle of firewood, the scurry of rats in the walls. Friendships blossomed in those low-lit chambers. Songs were whispered during evening tasks. A girl might confide her secrets while peeling root vegetables. A boy might boast of how quickly he could clear a chamber pot. There was even humor, crude and gallows-like. A shared joke about the lord's eating habits predicting the danger of passing beneath his privy. Tales of revenge where servants might time a bucket toss to coincide with someone else's unfortunate journey. Some castles had tales of the cursed bucket, an unlucky spot where everything that could fall would. Servants invented superstitions to explain the worst-located chutes, as if the structure had been built not by men, but by mischievous spirits with a taste for humiliation. They'd knock on beams or carry charms, hoping to avoid a literal disaster from above. The social contrast could not have been more stark. Just meters above, nobles dined on roasted meats, laid on feather beds, and used latrines built into warm towers. Below, the servants who ensured the smooth function of those luxuries lived with the consequence of their waste, sometimes literally falling into their world. Yet this system, as odd and uncomfortable as it might seem to us today, was a testament to medieval ingenuity and necessity. Castles were not designed for sanitation. They were built for defense, dominance, and the assertion of control. The internal infrastructure, such as it was, emerged as a series of compromises between comfort and practicality, between prestige and plumbing. And the servants bore the brunt of those compromises. Still, in the darkest corners of those drafty corridors, life went on. Meals were cooked. Beds were turned. Floors were scrubbed. And while the occasional splash from above may have been a rude reminder of their station, for many servants, life beneath the chute was simply life. Not cursed. Not extraordinary. Just one more part of the rhythm of their days. Just another note in the long, quiet song of castle existence. As we win deeper into the winding stairwells and secret corners of medieval castles, a curious truth begins to emerge, one not just of stone and sewage, but of status and separation. Toilets in castles were not all created equal. In fact, they mirrored the social hierarchy of the time with astonishing precision. The design, location, and even privacy of a latrine could reflect a person's position within the castle's rigid structure of power and privilege. Let's begin at the top, both socially and architecturally. The lord of the castle, along with his family and honored guests, were afforded garderobes that were tucked away in private chambers, often integrated directly into the stone walls of their living quarters. These were not communal facilities, nor were they hidden in some dank basement. Instead, they might be found off to the side of a bedchamber, near a solar or withdrawing room, behind a thick wooden door or even a decorative curtain. The stone seat was usually smoother, possibly maintained more regularly, and in some cases, lined with wood for comfort, a small luxury in a world of hard surfaces. Some higher status garderobes were even double-seaters, allowing for multiple occupants in shared but private conversation, a strange and rather uncomfortable notion by modern standards, but not entirely unheard of in times when privacy meant something different. In a society where communal experience was woven into daily life, even the act of relieving oneself could occur in tandem. At the next level were the knights, stewards, and household officers. These individuals, vital to the function and defense of the castle, were often provided with semi-private garderobes, usually located near dormitories or barracks. These garderobes might still discharge waste through shafts that dropped outside the wall, but the facilities were less lavish and more utilitarian. Still, compared to the lower tiers of castle society, they were far more dignified. The real change comes when we descend to the common servants, kitchen staff, grooms, stable hands, and labourers, those who kept the fires lit, the meals cooked, and the horses fed. These workers often had access only to shared latrines. In some castles, this meant nothing more than a stone bench with multiple openings lined up against an exterior wall. No doors. No curtains. Just the sound of others nearby and the cold stone beneath. These communal garderobes served not only as toilets but as social hubs of sorts, where gossip was exchanged, complaints muttered, and the daily grind briefly interrupted. Imagine the kitchen scullions huddled together during a break, catching a few minutes of rest while perched over the castle's waste chute. It may seem grim to us, but to them, it was a small, functional pause in a long day of toil. In some large castles, particularly in monastic or communal environments, entire latrine blocks existed, called reredators. These were long, stone-constructed rooms with rows of seats, often located at the far end of dormitory wings. Waste dropped into a shared channel beneath, sometimes with running water to flush it away. Such arrangements were seen in monasteries but also influenced the way castles organized communal waste for large groups. Gender, too, played a role. Women, especially noble women, were provided with private garderobes, often adjacent to their bedchambers. Privacy for women was more strictly observed in higher society, though again, this was shaped more by status than by gender alone. A noble lady might have a personal attendant to assist her and keep the space clean, whereas a low-ranking maid might have to share facilities with dozens of others. And then, there were the outsiders. Messengers, pilgrims, traveling entertainers, or other guests of lesser status might not be granted access to the main garderobes. Instead, they would be directed to temporary arrangements, wooden huts outside the castle walls, buckets placed discreetly in corners, or nothing at all. The smell of hospitality, in such cases, was quite literal. If you weren't part of the household, you could expect to feel it in your nose. Even within the hierarchy of space, the location of your toilet mattered. Upper-floor garderobes had gravity on their side. The higher the drop, the more distance from the waist below. Lower-floor garderobes, especially in tightly packed urban castles, might find themselves near overflowing pits or struggling with backup during wet weather. The flow of waste mirrored the flow of power, from the top down. This hierarchy was sometimes reinforced architecturally. In a multi-story castle, it was not uncommon for garderobes to be stacked vertically along the same wall, their chutes lined up one above the other, all dropping into the same cesspit or river bank. While this was efficient, it posed a curious risk for the lower floors. If the shaft of an upper garderobe wasn't perfectly aligned or if a gust of wind blew the wrong way, well, the results were unfortunate. Some castles took measures to prevent this. Stone or wooden baffles might be placed to direct the flow. Cleaning staff, usually low-ranking laborers, were tasked with maintaining the shafts and removing build-up. The smell of status was unmistakable, and those at the bottom quite literally carried the burden of those above. It's also worth noting how toilet access could be used as control. Punishment for minor offenses might include being banned from using the castle garderobe, forcing someone to relieve themselves outdoors or in a bucket, an embarrassing fate in a tightly packed environment. Waste, once again, became a tool for discipline and humiliation. In every sense, the medieval toilet was a reflection of its world, built around privilege, labor, and place. Cleanliness may not have been universal, but the message was clear. Where and how you relieved yourself was a marker of who you were, what you were worth, and how high you stood in the silent, unflinching ladder of castle life. From the stone seat in the Lord Solar to the drafty benches in the servant wing, the hierarchy of the garderobe reveals a society where even waste obeyed the rules of rank. As the Middle Ages gave way to the early modern period, the towering stone silhouettes of castles began to lose their military relevance. Cannons and gunpowder had changed the nature of warfare. Nobility started moving into more comfortable manor houses and palaces, where beauty and elegance were prized over sheer fortification. With this cultural shift came changes in architecture, hygiene, and domestic life, including a quiet but meaningful transformation in how people managed their waste. The medieval garderobe, for all its practical ingenuity, began to show its age. The first cracks in its reign weren't physical but philosophical. With the Renaissance and Enlightenment stirring across Europe, people began thinking differently about health, the body, and cleanliness. Medicine was still far from modern standards, but a growing interest in anatomy and sanitation led to the realization that living amid human waste, no matter how cleverly engineered, might not be the wisest choice. Castle residents were also becoming more mobile. Nobles traveled between estates, stayed in cities, and sought the comforts of refined urban living. Cities, too, were changing. Though many towns remained filthy by today's standards, the communal mindset began to shift. People wanted privacy, they wanted comfort, and increasingly, they wanted something that didn't smell like yesterday's stew bubbling in a pit below the floorboards. The rise of chamber pots accelerated this decline. Even in the age of castles, chamber pots had been common, especially at night or during bad weather. But as castles were replaced by sprawling estates and townhouses, chamber pots took center stage. They were cheap, movable, and, most importantly, easy to empty without relying on a specific architectural shaft or chute. Servants would collect and dispose of the contents each morning. It wasn't glamorous, but it allowed for more flexibility in room layouts. Yet, even chamber pots had limitations. They still required someone to clean them out, and they did nothing to remove the waste from the home entirely. The need for something better continued to rise. Enter the early incarnations of what would become the modern toilet. In the late 16th century, Sir John Harington, a godson of Queen Elizabeth I, designed a flushing toilet for his own home. It featured a cistern of water above a bowl, with a valve that released water to carry waste away. He even installed one for the Queen herself. But it was considered a novelty, and the idea didn't catch on widely, partly because of poor plumbing infrastructure and partly because, well, most people were still quite comfortable with their chamber pots. Still, the seeds were planted. Over the next 2 centuries, the concept of the water closet began to take shape. By the 18th and 19th centuries, indoor plumbing became more viable in wealthy homes. The Industrial Revolution brought with it not only steel and steam but also the modernization of city infrastructure, piped water, sewage systems, and sanitation planning. The garderobe, once a symbol of medieval practicality, was now an outdated curiosity. By the Victorian era, modern flush toilets had become symbols of progress. While not yet ubiquitous, they were spreading fast across cities in England, France, and beyond. Public health reformers campaigned for sewer systems. Engineers dug tunnels beneath streets. The idea of dropping your waste down a stone shaft into the moat below seemed not only primitive, it seemed dangerous. Moats, which had once teemed with waste from castle latrines, had long since been filled in or cleaned out. Castles that once discharged sewage directly into rivers or ditches were now viewed as health hazards. Some were retrofitted with pipes or modern conveniences, though most were abandoned or preserved as historical sites. Interestingly, as castles fell into ruin or were restored as romantic relics, garderobes became a point of fascination. Tour guides would point out the stone holes in the walls, the chutes, and the long drops to the ground below. Children would giggle. Adults would grimace. And historians would remind everyone, yes, people really did their business here. Every day. For centuries. What had once been a simple solution for castle life was now a symbol of the past, a relic of an era when architecture was forced to negotiate with biology in the most pragmatic of ways. The decline of the garderobe also marked a subtle shift in cultural attitudes toward waste itself. In the medieval world, bodily functions were acknowledged but rarely spoken of in polite company. Waste was an unavoidable part of life, something to be handled discreetly but without shame. But as modern sensibilities emerged, Victorian notions of propriety and privacy grew stronger. Bathrooms became sealed off, sanitized, and hidden. Waste was taboo, and the systems that handled it were increasingly designed to be invisible. In this way, the fall of the garderobe was not just about better engineering. It was about a transformation in how people viewed themselves, their bodies, and the spaces they inhabited. Still, the legacy of the castle toilet lingers in stone. Visitors to medieval ruins across Europe can still see the ghostly outlines of garderobes, little rooms jutting out over outer walls, narrow slits carved for air and light, deep vertical shafts that once carried more than just echoes. Some have been partially restored. Others are merely suggestive, a squared-out alcove where a stone seat once sat a day. And then there are the stories. Tales of invaders sneaking into castles through the waste chute. Of guards dropping hot sand, or worse, on enemies below. Of unfortunate servants caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. These stories remain a vivid reminder of just how central, even strategic, waste management was in the medieval world. Today, we flush a handle, press a button, or walk into a pristine stall with no thought of the engineering beneath our feet. But centuries ago, every bodily need had to be balanced against gravity, privacy, safety, and smell. That people solved this so consistently across generations and continents, with nothing more than stone, wood, and ingenuity, is something to admire, if not emulate. So the next time you pass by a medieval castle or flip through a history book, spare a thought for the garderobe. Not just for the people who used it, but for the masons who carved the shaft, the servants who scrubbed the bench, the engineers who kept the waste away from the food stores, and the sentries who hoped nothing too smelly fell on their heads. Because in a world of knights and lords, of sieges and swordplay, of faith and plague and pageantry, sometimes the most heroic design wasn't the turret or the drawbridge. It was the hole in the wall that made life just a little more livable. And so, we come to the quiet end of our long, curious journey through the winding stone corridors and moss-covered walls of medieval castles, places not only of power and war, but of clever, sometimes odd, daily survival. In the grand halls where kings feasted and lords conspired, beyond the archways and tapestries, there were also the garderobes, humble little chambers perched above the void. These simple structures, often overlooked in tales of glory and conquest, were in many ways the beating heart of medieval practicality. The people of the past, just like us, had needs. And though they lived by torchlight and prayer, by sword and superstition, they still sought cleanliness, comfort, and clever solutions to life's unavoidable necessities. A hole in a bench. A shaft down a wall. A chute to the moat. What seems laughable now was, then, a stroke of architectural wisdom. As you rest your head and drift further into sleep, picture the stone towers in soft moonlight, their walls echoing with the lives once lived inside. Imagine the cold breeze through a garderobe slit, the creak of wooden doors, the distant splash of waste-meeting water far below. These ancient places remind us that even in the darkest ages, humanity found ways to cope, to innovate, to endure. In grand castles and crumbling keeps, people didn't just survive, they adapted. They lived. They flashed in their own way. So let the flicker of candlelight fade. Let the echoes of clanking armor and laughter in the great hall grow quiet. And as the stone walls fall into stillness, may you,